everybody, and good morning, and welcome to session 3 of Computerized Quilting on a Domestic Machine. If you have questions for our presenter, please type your questions into the questions box. We're going to have a short question and answer session at the very end. We did have a lot of wonderful questions from the previous sessions, and our presenter Connie today is going to go over some of those as well, as many as we can. We have 3 handouts located in the handout section. They are the first 2 handouts from our first 2 sessions and the one for today. So make sure you download those during the presentation. If you are viewing on an Apple product, please make sure that you can swipe left or right on your screen and to view either the presentation or the videos. The handouts are located in the More section at the very bottom. And let's go to, if you have any audio or technical difficulties, please make sure you exit the webinar, turn your browser off, and reopen the webinar. That solves most problems. We will have a lot of videos today to show you. Please make sure your pop-off blocker setting is turned off. And also the webinars are being recorded, and so you'll be able to watch the videos again here in a few days once we get them loaded to BERNINA.com. And so I'd like to welcome you to the presentation. Today is Connie Fanders, and hi, Connie.
Well, hello, Emily, and hello, everybody out there. I'm excited to be here today to go over webinar 3, where we're going to talk about precise design positioning. So let me show my screen here, and then we can get started. All right, so like I said, we are ready to start stitching today, so I'm quite excited to begin. The topics that we're going to talk about are hooping the quilt. We're going to talk about how to set up the machine, how to handle the quilt, and then how to precisely place these designs on our quilts. And as Emily did mention, you guys did really have a lot of wonderful questions after webinar 1 and 2. And so I have incorporated some of those answers into the presentation today for webinar 3. And then I do have several of them in slides way at the end. So if you can hang on to the end, I'll try and go through as many of those questions as possible. If I don't get them in webinar 3, we'll go over them in webinar 4. But let's begin right now about talking about hooping the quilt and the different types of hoops that are available. So first of all, for hooping quilts, when I'm doing the computerized quilting, my ultimate favorite hoop is our hoops with the twist locks on them. And I'm going to turn on my laser pointer here so you can see. And what I mean by twist lock hoops is we do have 3 embroidery hoops that have this twist lock right here. And this is on the outer hoop of the hoop. And it is located in the front on the right side of the hoop, which makes it very convenient for computerized quilting when we need to open up the hoop to remove the inner hoop in order to move the quilt around. Because as you will see later in this presentation, you'll see that when I do computerized quilting, I leave my outer hoop on the module the entire time. And so having this in front to be able to release the inner hoop and then tighten it is a huge advantage. Also, it is very easy to release. This part right here, this is just a little button that you push in. And when you push that in, what happens is it releases this hoop. And with the maxi and the jumbo hoop, this area, this amount of space is a good 5/8 of an inch. So that does give you a large amount of space to be able to put the layers of your quilt in. And then to tighten it, you just simply turn the ratchet and it tightens it very securely. And nothing is going to move, it's not going to shift as you are quilting. And even with the different weights and the different thicknesses of the battings that you choose to move, you can be certain that it's not going to shift in the hoop. These hoops are also very sturdy, and they do support multiple layers of batting, and it does support the weight of the hoop. So these are the 3 hoops that I personally prefer to use when I am doing computerized quilting. So now let's look a little bit more about the size in the hoops and what the differences are between the jumbo and the mega and the midi hoop. So the jumbo hoop, you can see here I've put what the stitch field is. So that tells you this entire area can be filled with stitches if you so desire. And the jumbo hoop is really designed for the 8 series machine, either the 830 or the 880 it will work on. You can also put this jumbo hoop on a 7 series machine. However, you know, the 7 series machine is a shorter arm. Therefore, there's 2 inches on the side of this hoop that you won't be able to fill with stitches, of course, because of the size of the machine. But it absolutely does work on that module. Then we have the maxi hoop. And here again, this is the size of the stitch area. And this hoop will work, of course, on the 8 series machines as well as on all of the 7 series machines. And so this is designed for that 10-inch arm that we have, or the 10 inches from, you know, the needle to the inside of the machine. And so this works beautifully on these 7 series machines. And then we have the midi hoop, and this, of course, on the 8 series and the 7 series, but then it works also on the 5 series. And it is designed for that length of the arm that is on the current 5 series machines. So these are the machines, or the hoops, and the machines that they are compatible with. Now, if you have a BERNINA machine and these twist lock hoops do not fit on your machine, you can by all means use the medium and the large, or even the mega hoop that come with it. The main difference is, you know, the twist lock. It does not have the twist lock, and it has the standard screw to open and close it. Now, in the questions, we did get several questions about using magnetic hoops, and that is certainly an option that you can try. I personally have not used them a lot to really give a good comparison, but I do know people have had good results with those also. With the magnetic hoops, the thing for you to really test is to make sure that the magnets are strong enough so that there is no shifting of that quilt, because, you know, if that quilt does shift, it will offset your pattern a little bit. And then also, you know, with the drag of the quilt, you just, again, want to make sure that it holds it securely in there. But you can certainly try them as well, and you know, come up with what is your preference for the hoops. So after you have your hoop chosen for your particular project, let's talk about hooping the quilt. Now, if your design that you're embroidering is in the middle of the quilt, no problem. You just hoop it in the middle and you're ready to go. But what happens if you're doing a border or something on the edge? Well, you do absolutely need to have fabric in your hoop all the way around. And so what you do need to do if you are planning to embroider on an edge is there's 2 different things you can do. And one is to really plan ahead and make sure that your backing is larger than the rest of your quilt, as you see pictured here in this first image. And, you know, to be able to be all hooped in our hoop, you need to leave at least 3 inches of fabric, of the backing fabric extended. Since our hoops, you know, we can stitch very close to the edge on our hoops. So we don't need, you know, a lot of extra fabric, but you do need at least 3 inches to be able to hoop it off. And then if I do it this method where the backing is larger, I will go and do that basting stitch all the way around the quilt, just to hold all those layers together on that edge as I am hooping and rehooping for that border. And then you can see here in the last image what it looks like with the hoop on. Now, the other method, if you didn't have enough backing fabric to leave 3 inches around, I have also just sewn on a tube of fabric. So right here, what you see is I took like a 6.5 or 7 inch strip. I sewed down it, and then I flipped it around so I have a tube. And so I ended up with a 3 inch tube of fabric, and I have it in a very long length. And so I can just sew it on the edge of my quilt. I should say sew, I mean baste. I baste it onto the edge of my quilt, because this, of course, will come off after the quilt is done. So that's the second option for being able to extend your fabric enough to be able to hoop it. So now let's talk a little bit about setting up your machine. And these are, again, my preferences in all of my trial and error of doing all of these quilts. But what I like to do, of course, is set up my machine and my module on my cabinet. And I do have the extension of the cabinet raised when I begin. If you do not have a cabinet, no worries. You can set your machine on a table, but I do recommend to still put another table behind it. I have heard of some people using an ironing board and lowering it to the height of the table just to extend that space so that it will support your quilt if you're doing a larger quilt. So this is the setup of the machine that I like to have. And then I always do attach my slide-on table. And then, as I said earlier, I attach my outer hoop. And this is how my machine is set up and ready to go when I am ready to start quilting my quilt with the embroidery machine. So next, how do we handle the quilt? How do we put it in and out of this as we're quilting throughout the quilt? So what I'm going to do is just walk you through these steps, and then I do have a video that will play that will actually show what I'm explaining here. So the first step, the first time you're doing the very first design in the quilt, you're just going to lay the quilt over the module, the slide-on table, and my hoop is underneath this. My outer hoop is there. So you just slide your quilt into position, and you get the area that you want to quilt first under the needle. Then the next step is to slip the inner hoop. Now you're going under the needle and you're slipping it in place. And at this point right here, I am really adjusting the fabric. I'm moving the fabric and I'm getting it into the place where I want to tighten my hoop down. So once you put your inner hoop in there, remember when you open that mega hoop, or not the mega, excuse me, the maxi hoop, you have a good 5/8 inch space, so you can move that quilt around. And this goes all the way back to when we do our securing stitches. This is why it's important to secure all of those layers, because you are going to kind of shift and move this around to get it placed in the hoop right where you want it to be. Doing it this way, and I'm going to show you the way I mark my quilts in a little bit, I never have to use any templates, and I'm able to very easily move to different parts of my quilt and just position the quilt where I need it to be for stitching. So after I have it positioned and I have everything flat, then I will go and I'll tighten the ratchet, and then I'm simply ready to quilt. And I quilt the stitch and then I'm done. Now, after the quilting of the particular design is completed, then of course you loosen the ratchet. And then what I like to do is I like to just take the inner hoop and I just swing it around the arm of the machine. And I leave it up there as I am moving the fabric around. The midi hoop, actually, it does flip up here. I do have to turn that vertically to be able to get over the head here, but that midi hoop goes around here as well. And so it just keeps it kind of out of the way, but yet it's still convenient that I can easily pop it back on my fabric when I get the next area in place. And then finally, you put the hoop back down and then you are ready to go. So those are the steps that I took, and now I'm going to, let's see, go and look at my, well, I gotta find where the videos are. And Emily, I'm not finding my videos this morning here.
It's under the sharing tab. Sharing tab, and it says show.
Okay, got it. Thank you. All right, so here we go. Okay, so that gives you just kind of a quick visual of how it is that I hoop my fabric the first time around. You did notice, and I'll point this out, as I put the fabric in the inner hoop here, I do start in the back, and I place the back of the inner hoop in first, and then I work around to the front. In this particular video, I was matching up a line in that border that I had drawn, with the fabric marker, and I was working to center that in this hoop. And we'll explain more about that later, but just to give a little bit more reference on that particular video, because we'll talk about it later. So it's really that simple to move from one place to another on your quilt if you have your machine set up in the way that I have shown here. So that is the setup of the machine. So now let's talk about that precise placement of our designs. And this is a question that we get all the time. So let's go through it. So placement of a design. When you're doing a quilt, really there's 3 different places that you need to place a design. It'll either be in a block, and in the blocks I happen to have for my quilts, they are round blocks, but they don't have to be. They can be a square block. But you would do a placement in blocks. You would need to place designs in borders, as you see on the color chart quilt. And in this pillow here, this is actually borders right here. And then there's the negative space of quilts that we need to fill. And the negative spaces can be done with either edge-to-edge quilting. What I'm doing here is I actually make blocks that I'm quilting in here. Or, you can randomly place designs and fill in with free motion quilting or ruler work, as I have done on the quilt behind me. So these are the areas that we need to place a design in a quilt. And for my placement, for all of the quilts that I have worked on, I use 3 features or 3 methods of placing. And one is simply just finding that design center. You can do so much with just knowing how to locate the center of that design. Absolute check is another feature that I use a lot. And both of these features are on many of our embroidery machines, of the BERNINA embroidery machines that go many years back. And then we have pinpoint placement, which is a fairly new feature that we now have on some of our machines as well. So I'm going to go through how I use these 3 features in placing either blocks, borders, or in negative space. And so we're going to just start with placement of the design in a block. And in these blocks, as I said, I just found the center position. So all I did was, first of all, just marked the center of these designs here. And then I line up my hoop under the needle to where my mark is. I will show this in just a little bit. So that's the first method. Then what I do like to do is I use absolute check then to ensure that the edge of my design does not go past where I want it to be, or maybe I see that the design is too small and then I have to enlarge it. So absolute check, what this is, it's a feature that you can, on your screen of your machine, you can point to or select any point of the design, and the hoop will move the fabric or your hoop fabric under the needle to that exact point that you have selected. Therefore, you can see on your fabric any point in that design that you want to check its location. So to explain this further, I'm going to, first of all, open up the simulator, and I'm going to show it on the simulator, and then I'm going to show a video doing this. Because on the simulator, you only get to see, what's happening on the machine, and you don't see what's happening with the hoop, because every time you do something on the screen, something with the hoop happens. So I'll show you first on the simulator here what I'm doing, and then I'll show the video where you can see the hoop moving as I'm selecting these things. Okay, so first of all, what we want to do is find the center of this particular design. And so to do that, I'm going to go into my information screen. And if you select the check box right here, this will open up. And this icon right here indicates where your needle is. So if you look at the design right now, my needle is positioned right in the corner of this design. Well, I want to know where the center of this design is. So I'm simply going to select this. And did you see how this popped now to the center of my design? So now if I was on my actual machine, I'd be turning my stitch width and my stitch length dials, but since I'm on the simulator, I just have to click here. And so, but as I click the width dial, you can see the design is moving, but what is actually happening is the hoop is moving. And it's, if you turn the this zigzag width dial, the design moves horizontally. If you use the straight stitch dial, then the design moves vertically in there. So you can see how I'm moving the design around in the hoop. So that is how you would center the hoop, or center the design in the hoop. You first find the center, and then you would use the width and the length dials to move the hoop until your needle is positioned right over that mark. So now this next step that I like to do, as I said, is absolute check. And I want to check the outside of the design to make sure it's not extending beyond the borders of my block. And so with absolute check, like I said, I can click at any point on my design, and what is actually happening to the hoop, which we can't see, is the hoop is moving. And it is moving to, so that the position that I've pointed at here is now directly under the needle in my hoop. And so I can go all the way around the outer edges of this design. My hoop will be moving, and I will be absolutely checking where that design is stitching. So that's what I'm going to be doing. And now let me go to the videos, see if I can play this one. And now this is going to be the absolute check video. Do note, I forgot to mention, 3 of the 4 videos that I'm showing today, I did not do a voiceover, and I just added the words to it. So this video does not have any words. It's just me showing how to do the absolute check in the center and then the hoop moving. Okay, that video does actually go on more and stitch the whole design out, but I decided to stop it. And I did leave on the thread up command, and that was a question we had, was to show that again. Because when you start stitching it out, I do like to bring the bobbin thread to the top, and that so that it doesn't follow the design underneath. And so by selecting my needle up and down before I begin, it will bring that bobbin thread up, and that's the thread up command. So that's all we need to do for placement of the blocks when we can use the center design or the center positioning of a block. It's really quite simple. So now let's go to the next one. Let's go to pinpoint placement. So we, in this quilt here, this faded quilt, I quilted the entire quilt with this block that you see here. I started with this triangle design, and then what I did was I duplicated it and mirror imaged it, and so then I ended up with a square design. And so this square design is what I repeated throughout this entire quilt. And the way that I did was, here you can see there's 4 panels, I guess, 4 of these designs put together in one panel. And right here, you see this design that is right here. And the way I quilted this was I started with the first section of this and quilted it. And then I went to the next section. I rotated the design. So now here's my start point and my end point. And then again, I rotated the design, went to the next. And then here's my last design, my start point and my end point. So that is how this entire design was quilted. So there were 3 of these large 4 squares going across. So there was one here, and one here. If you can, hopefully you can see my pointer there. So so that's the way that this was actually quilted. And to get this precisely placed, I used the pinpoint placement feature. And I chose this feature over the absolute check because it's the bottom point here. Let me just turn my laser on. It's this bottom point right here and this top point right here that I precisely want in the corners of these blocks. And so with pinpoint placement, I was able to precisely place those right where I needed, regardless if my blocks were perfectly square or not, and I'll show you why. So what you see here is, I'm going to go ahead and put my pointer on. This is what the quilt looked like after I had it all secured with my basting stitches. And these are the blocks in which I'm putting this design. So now you see I have the fabric hooped, and I'm going to turn this off here. Okay, it won't let me click if my laser's on. Okay, so now you can see these are the actual basting stitches that I put into the quilt. And so with the pinpoint placement, we do exactly what the name implies. We pinpoint right where we want our points to be in the quilt, and we can set those points. So right here and right here are the points that I want to set. And so when I open up pinpoint placement in a little bit, what I'm going to be doing is making sure the needle or the center of my foot is exactly at this point. And this is my first set point. And then I will move the hoop, and then I will put this, again, the needle and that right over the corner here, and then I'll set my second point. So let me open up again the simulator and show you how we're going to do this. So this is the same design we just had, and now I'm going to position it using pinpoint placement. But before I do that, I am going to turn my grid on so you can actually see a little bit better the movement and the rotation that I'm going to be able to do with pinpoint placement. So pinpoint placement, the icon that you would select is right here for pinpoint placement. And when you open pinpoint placement, you have a choice of how you want to set those 2 points that we can set. And the first is, if I select the grid, this grid appears. And so I've got, I've got 9 points that I can choose in which to set. And for this design, I'm actually going to choose this point here and this point here. But before I do that, I want to show you what the alternate way of doing it is. And we could select this here, and this is free point positioning. So that means I'm not restricted to just those 9 points. I can select any point on this design and say, okay, I want my needle right here for the first point, and then I can set it. Then I can select someplace else, and I can say, I want my needle, my second point, to be right here. But for the purposes of what we're doing today, I'm going to select the grid, and then I'm going to select my first set point. So I select it, and you can see how it's highlighted. And then again, you go to your stitch width and your length dials, and you can move this design. So I'm moving this too, and right now, if we could see my fabric, my hoop would be moving. And I would be positioning this needle right over that corner point of my design. And so when I get it into the right place, I simply click set. And now this turns yellow, indicating that this point is set. And so now I'm going to do my second point, which is here. And again, I'm going to move it. And when you see the video, it's like right up here that I need to move it to. So we would be rotating here and then here and moving it up. And when you get it to the point you want, you hit set, and then you're ready to go. And you can see by this grid how I have just slightly rotated and actually kind of skewed that design so it fits perfectly in the space. So let me go ahead and go to this video and show you this placement here.
To position a design using pinpoint placement, first open the information screen and then select pinpoint placement. You will first select the grid and then the first stitch point that you want to set. Once you have the point selected, turn your stitch width and your length dials until you get the needle precisely over the first point that you want to set in this design. Once it is where you want it to be, simply select Set on the screen. Now your first set point is selected and set. Now let's set the second point that you want to set in the design. And again, you will move the stitch width and the stitch length dials until the needle is positioned precisely where you want that point to be. Notice on the machine screen how the design is rotating and actually resizing just a little bit in order to fit precisely in the area that you need that to be. That is the beauty of pinpoint placement. Once you have the first point set, the second point can be used to adjust the size and the rotation of the design ever so slightly, so it will be perfect in your block.
Okay, so that explains pinpoint placement. So I hope you have a better understanding of the power of this particular feature. So now let's start talking about the placement of borders and how we would use pinpoint placement for placing these borders. In the color chart quilt, the entire border that I did was using the computerized quilting method, and I placed these all using pinpoint placement. So right here you will see the picture. This is the actual picture off of the pattern of the design. And what really drew my attention to this design was the width of this border and what they had in the border. And I immediately thought, oh, that's a perfect design. That's a perfect quilt to show computerized quilting. So here's my interpretation of the quilt. Not much different, but my border, I do have a nice wide border, but you will notice it's a little bit different. It doesn't go all the way to the end. And I'll explain why. The actual border, and I enlarged this so it is a little fuzzy, but this actual border for the pattern is 10 inches. And I wanted to keep that 10 inches because I think that's really what helps make the focal point in the center of this quilt. And so I wanted to keep that 10 inches. And so you can see what I did to that border in order to keep that 10 inches, but yet be able to hoop it quite easily. So what I did is, if you look at, now this is the maxi hoop, the one that I have pictured here. And I have the template in there so you can actually see, I put some straight lines here. And for this particular quilt, I decided that if I could do a 7-inch tall, 7-inch border, I could fill in the top and the bottom with something else, and with free motion quilting or whatever. And so if I did 7 inches here on my quilt, on my hoop, then that means I have 11 inches here that I have a perfect rectangle to make. So I could choose a border that was 7 inches by 11 inches. And so now you can see I extended the 7 inches, and this is what I did. So I made my border here exactly that 7 inches because I knew it would fit in there, and then I filled in the rest with a ribbon stitch free motion. So now I know the height of my design. Now I have to figure out what the width of it's going to be. And on this quilt, this part of the border on each side, and that's another thing I liked about it. I didn't have to deal with a corner or a mitered corner or anything here. I liked how it was just a straight edge. And so this is 49 inches is what I needed to fill in of the border. So doing the math, that comes out to my border needs to be 9 3/4 inches by 7 inches. And that is actually a perfect size, because if you think back to the image of the hoop, I've got 11 inches by 7 inches, and actually a little bit more because there is a good 1/4 of an inch on each side of that 7 inches. So I have some wiggle room when I'm trying to hoop this border, and I don't have to worry about getting it in the hoop exactly precisely straight. So this is the size of the border that I'm going to put in my quilt. And this particular design here, you can choose any border design, and you can enlarge or reduce the size of it. In your machine, you can reduce and enlarge. It's recommended to not go either higher or lower than 20%. So if you do need to do a lot of sizing to your design, my recommendation would be to go to that software. You can download the free software with ArtLink, put the design in there and resize it. It will recalculate the stitches. And of course, if you have the Designer Plus software, you can do the same thing. This actual design, I digitized myself because I really liked that zigzag pattern. Then another thing that you want to notice on your design, if you think way back to the very first webinar here, is the start and the end points. This is the start point of my design. This is the end point. And these are actually going to be my pinpoint placement lines as well, or marks for my pinpoint placement. So now here you see I've just drawn the line on top of my quilt. My patterns are going to be 9 3/4 inch wide, which means I need 5 hoopings, and they're going to be 7 inches tall. And what I do to my fabric then is I will mark, actually I didn't draw a line all the way across, I just marked here and here because I knew that was my start and end marks. That's where I knew I was going to do my pinpoint placement. So I did a mark every 9 3/4 inches. And then I did another line that I drew with a fabric marker right down the center. Because think back now to that video of hooping. This was the center line that I matched up with the center of my hoop. Well, here it shows it here. So this was my center lines that I was matching up as I was doing my hoop. And so that's all there is to it. I went then to pinpoint placement, and I did that. So I have the last video here where it's just quickly going to show how I lined this particular design. Okay, so again, that showed you how that was positioned using the pinpoint placement. So that wraps up our webinar for today on pinpoint placement of your designs, and how you hoop your fabrics. So I hope you join me for the last webinar in this series, where we're going to be talking about choosing the best quilting techniques for your next project. And what I will be doing is going through each of the projects we've been using in this series, and I'll go step by step through them and explain everything from needles to battings, the design, what I used, why I used it. And that will give you some things to think about as you are planning your next project. So now it's time for question and answers, and I did go over just a little bit. So to begin with, I am going to go through some of the questions that came in from the webinars on 1 and 2. I'll do about 5 minutes of those, and then I'll ask Emily if we have any questions that came in today. And then the remainder of these questions I'll bring into session 4 when we do that, or webinar 4 when we do that. So one of the questions that came up with, and I was so curious, I just had to try it. We had questions about, what about using invisible thread? What about using metallic thread? What about sewing on minky? So immediately after the second webinar, I tried it. And so I did get some invisible thread. And now, mind you, I didn't do entire quilts, and I'm just testing small samples. So this is the results of the small samples that I did. But where I had success on this in using invisible thread, right here on this, if you look right here, this is one stitching here. So on the top, I used invisible thread, and on the bottom, I used a 50 weight cotton. Over here, I used invisible thread on top, and yes, I put the invisible thread on the bobbin. And I have to tell you, it was beautiful. It was a beautiful stitch out. What I did for the needle, what I found I had the most success with, is a Microtech size 70 needle. I did loosen my tension to 2.5. And then very important, when winding the bobbin with the invisible thread, I did slow it way down. I did not want any stretching of that thread as it was being wound in the bobbin. And then also when I embroidered, I slowed down. Just put the speed way down, and that is where I had success. So invisible thread, absolutely. Yenmet, metallic. So for metallic threads, Yenmet was what I happen to have here at home. I've had very good luck with embroidery using the Yenmet thread in the metallics. You can't really see the metallic here, but I did use metallic. And again, the top of this design here was metallic. The bottom, I used the 50 weight cotton. And on this one here, I put the Yenmet in the bobbin and on the top just to test it. And where I had success was I used that same Microtech needle, size 70. Basically, it's the same setup as with the invisible thread. The tension I did lower to 2.5. And oh, I should mention too, I should have put it on here. I had the standard bobbin case in. I did not need to use the high thread tension. I'm on 790 is what I have access to right now. And I did slow down the bobbin when I wound it, and I did slow it down when embroidering as well. Then to try the minky, I tried that. I put a cotton gauze on top because that's what we see a lot, and I used a poly batting. And actually on the other 2 samples, I had a poly batting in those as well. And the needle that I had a lot of success with was a stretch needle, and it was size 75. And I did put a cotton thread for the top and the bottom. Here is what you see. Here's the top, here's the bottom. And there, I made a note here, just so I'd remember to tell you, I did not put any stabilizer. You know, a lot of times when we, in regular embroidery, when we stitch something with a nap, say a towel or something such as that, we recommend to put in a water-soluble stabilizer on top or in between here so that it keeps the stitching on top instead of sinking into the fabric. Well, minky would actually be one fabric where if I was doing normal embroidery, I would put that. I chose not to put it here on this quilt when I did my samples. and this is the result. So, you know, it's your choice. I didn't have the time to try it with there and wash it out to see what the result would be. But, you know, for quilting, personally, I think this would be fine, and I don't see a need because in through washings, this is going to fluff up more, and I think would be just fine. But that's what my quick results of those tests were. Then we had another question about to review what stitches had the securing stitches. So I put them here. We had a question on having trouble removing the securing stitches with the OESD designs. We showed that, and it seems to be built into the design. Even with the Designer Plus software, this person could not remove it. And so what I would check is to make sure that the design you're using is ART format. And also when you go into the settings, make sure to select the design. So, you know, go to the arrow in the corner, select it so it turns pink, and then go into your settings. And so then the design is activated when you go to change to either remove or add the securing stitches. So give that a try and see if that doesn't help you out. And then we had more questions on securing stitches. I grouped all of your questions into categories. The question was tie on, tie off. Which is overriding which way it goes? Is it the computer or the sewing machine, or which way? And if I'm understanding the question correctly, you have to think of it, okay, so you've got your embroidery design, and it either has the securing stitches or it doesn't have them. And so if you take that design into your computer, then your computer is overriding what the digitizer digitized on that design. If you take that design and you bring it into the sewing machine, the only thing that the Smart Secure feature will do is add the securing stitch if the design doesn't have it. And so, so in that case, the machine would override what the design has not digitized in terms of securing stitches. So I hope that answered your question there. The next question is, if you wanted securing stitches and it's in the software, why would you override it with Smart Secure? So why would you do that? Because I mentioned in the other webinars that my preference is to first go into the software and just remove the securing stitches. And I like to just remove them there instead of adding them there, because I want the control at my machine. Because depending upon where I'm putting that design, you know, maybe one design that I'm stitching out, okay, in this area, I do want to tie a knot because this is in a huge focal point. And so I don't want my securing stitch there, so I'm going to leave it off. But maybe in another place with that same design on that same quilt, maybe I do want it, and I can control it there. So that's why I like to start with just no securing stitches, and then I can add them as I want. Then where do you find the tie on and tie off stitches in the software? And with that, I have my software ready here. Just pop it up. So so this is what I mean by selecting the stitch. You know, make sure it's highlighted in pink that it's selected. And so then when you go into settings up here, you go into object properties, and then it's connectors or tie in, tie off, just kind of depending upon your version. But this is the tab that you're going to select in this dialog box. And then it is right here where you, if you want to delete them, you would say never tie in and never tie off, and then say apply. There's another question that came through about asking where you change that triple stitch. It's the same dialog box, and you just go to outline stitch. And right now, this particular design is a single stitch, and the stitch length is 2.5. Well, if I wanted to, I could change this to a triple stitch and do it that way. Okay, so what time? Oh, yes, we are getting close on time. So I think I'll stop there with the questions from the other day. And Emily, do you have questions for today that I can answer?
Hi, everybody. Yes, we have so many questions. Okay.
Okay.
So I'm going to start at the top. Okay. Can you quilt on a domestic machine, a quilt that's a twin size or larger? Connie, what have you done? What's like the largest size project you've done?
Okay, the color chart quilt is a 60 by 60, and the one behind me, the Tula chevron quilt, is a 47 by 57. I'm right in the midst of piecing a queen size quilt to give that a try. With these two quilts, I have two different weights of batting, and I had no drag at all and no pulling on my hoop. That's the biggest problem with the drag, is if it pulls on the hoop, and the twist lock hoops held it beautifully. But to this point, that's the largest, but I'm absolutely going to try larger. Can't wait.
Awesome. The next question, we had a couple people ask about this. Should you always start in the middle of your quilt? Do you use rows or columns? How do you, where do you start?
Okay, it depends upon your quilt. As I said in the other webinar, you know, if it's a border, well, of course, it's going to be on the side. With the other quilts, like the faded quilt that we showed the pinpoint placement today, I did start with the center block and I work out. And that is my preference, you know, if that works out. I do like to start in the center and work my way out on the designs. But again, it really depends upon where your designs are placed and where you would go. This Tula quilt behind me too, it's hard to see the embroidered designs, and I wanted it that way. I just kind of wanted them to be a surprise when somebody was just really looking. And those are randomly placed all over the quilt. And with that as well, I started more in the center and worked my way out.
Awesome. The next question, we have a consumer who has a 700 embroidery machine, which we love, and
Yes.
it only comes with the yellow bobbin case. So she was wondering if she should purchase the black bobbin case for doing this technique.
Only if she's not able to get her tension correct. So, you know, if you're having problems and you want to perfect it even more, then yeah, that would be a good suggestion.
Okay. A few people were wondering which embroidery foot you recommend. I believe in one of your shots you were possibly using the 24 foot. Can you go over which feet are the best for this technique?
Okay, I actually prefer, I don't know if you can see it, but I prefer to use the 26, the teardrop foot. Sometimes you will see in my videos or pictures that I do put on a different foot, and that is purely for the picture or the video's sake. So you can see where the needle is being positioned. So when I'm actually embroidering though, I like to use the teardrop 26.
Quite a few people have asked what kind of fabric marker or marking tools you prefer to use.
I really hate to give out brands, but my favorite is the Fixin pen, you know, that you can just heat it and it goes away.
I love this too.
I do a lot of times use the Clover chalk. It's a triangle. I forget the actual name of it, but I use that sometimes as well. If it's a darker fabric and I need to see my line, that's my go-to one there, or even the Clover chalk wheel. Yeah.
Wonderful. Let's see. Somebody asked me a question. Does Emily recommend machine basting versus pinning? I use a combination of both as well. I don't want anything moving on me, so the more the better.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. Oh, you know, I want to just jump in. I have it later in my questions, but somebody asked about a 570 and not having that basting stitch, number 21. And on the 570, the basting stitch is actually number 30. And that was a question that came in. And I want to make sure I tell you that if you're listening. You know, the number 21 is that number on most BERNINA machines, but not all BERNINA machines. The basting stitch is a stitch we've had for a long time. So if it's not number 21 or number 30, do check, look around on your machine, and chances are you have it.
Okay, and let's see here. Do you happen to know what the stitch field is on the jumbo hoop if using a 790?
You can go up to 8 1/4 inches wide, and it's still the 15 in length, 15 3/4, I believe, in length.
Okay.
It's the same, basically the same size as what you would get with the mega hoop.
Sure. We had a question about, do you leave your embroidery module attached when regular sewing and not embroidering? I know it's a little off topic, but I was intrigued.
No, but you absolutely can, because you can put your module in part position so the arm of the module scoots out of the way. But when I am regular sewing, I do take it off, and then I like to lower my machine in the cabinet, so then everything is flush with the top of the cabinet.
One consumer has a question about pulling up the thread on an 880 plus. She's a little confused on how to do that. Is there any way you can go over that again?
Is she talking about the thread up command?
Let me see here. I lost her question. I think she was just talking about pulling up the bobbin thread.
Okay, well, basically, just to take up the bobbin thread, you need to basically just take a stitch. And on the machines that have the thread up command, we make it very easy. You don't even have to push on the foot control or anything. You just push the needle up and down button, and it does the whole needle in the fabric and then back out and raises the foot. But to bring the bobbin thread up, you're just taking a stitch and then popping it up to the top.
Someone had a question about using .art files. I think she was a little confused on, we usually use .exp. Can you talk about the difference in those files?
Oh, yes. And I can see where you're confused. It took me a while to get all that straight in my head too. And the ART format is the native format that BERNINA software uses. So if you have an embroidery design that's an ART or .art file, then that means it's a pure design, that you can do all kinds of manipulating to the design and changing of the design because you're working in its pure format. However, to send it to the machine, if you have the software or if you're using ArtLink, the free software, when we send it to like a USB stick to take it to a machine, the software changes it then to the EXP format. And then that is the format that the machine uses. And so you can make all the changes you want in ART format, but then it actually stitches it out in EXP. I hope that explains it. Yeah.
That was wonderful. Okay, let's see. Francis wants to know, when quilting, which bobbin case do we use?
I always start first with the standard one. If you're on a 5 or a 7 series machine, I start with the standard bobbin case, and where we're trying to get a balanced tension rather than a tension we get when we're embroidering, because that's a whole different tension than what we're working with here in computerized quilting. So I will use the standard bobbin case first to see if I get a balanced tension. And if I don't, then that's when I go to the high thread tension bobbin case.
Sure. Do you prefer to use the largest hoop, example a jumbo hoop, or the smaller size, maybe a midi? Does the size of the hoop matter when quilting?
I use the size of the hoop according to the size of the design. Mm-hmm. I don't, because that just, if you're hooped closer to the edge of the design, there's more stability, basically mm-hmm. what it boils down to. So, so I will match my hoop to the size of the design.
And if you're not quite sure on which hoop you should use for the design, does the machine tell you, or maybe give you a little hint, a recommendation?
Well, when you bring the design into the machine, it's going to recognize its size and then, yes, give you the suggested size. Yeah.
Okay. Do you happen to know what is the basting stitch on an 880? Is it still number 21?
I don't have that simulator open. I believe it is. I'm not 100% on that though.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. We have a couple more questions here. Let's see. Another question about if you're using an 880, do you thread for sewing or embroidery?
Again, I start out with it for sewing because you're trying
Okay.
to get that balance stitch. And then if that's not working, if it's not giving you the stitch you want, then thread it for embroidery.
Sure. Okay, that is all the time we have for questions. If you'd like to wrap up the presentation.
Okay, I'm going to have to flip through all the rest of these questions that we'll do later. Oh, this is one I do want to talk about. We'd had several questions asking about the patterns, and I used several different ones. 3 of them I used patterns from a company called Zen Chick, and then here is the chevron quilt that I used. On the pillow that I did, actually my inspiration came from Amanda Murphy's ruler workbook. And I saw the stacked coins and how she had the design in there, and I thought that would be perfect to show that border. So those are my patterns.